Hello there, welcome to a Second Thoughts overview of Nakai the Wanderer of the Lizardmen. So I played through the initial turns, checked the victory conditions, the starting location, buildings, etc. And now I have a grasp of how the faction plays out. So these are my conclusions, and in the end I'll show you some army compositions that I would like to try out. Like always, a disclaimer, this is not an in-depth guide, but will have elements of it. Basically what I would do before starting up a campaign. It should help you out to enjoy the faction. So let's go play with Nakai of the Lizardmen. So for your short victory condition, you need to destroy the factions of the Blessed Dread, the Dead Flag Fleet, and Yangshi Rebels. So basically, these are all in the straight up line, you know, by destroying one you get to the other, and yeah, it's pretty much a straight up victory condition. You also need to occupy, loot, raise, or sack 30 different settlements, which is kind of basic, but yeah, mostly expand in the same direction, get rid of those factions. Very cool. Then we have the long campaign. Achieve the short victory conditions, occupy, loot, raise, or sack 70 different settlements, and destroy the same faction. So basically this is an oversight, of course this is included in the short victory. You need to destroy Clan Eshin, the Puppets of Misrule, the Caravan of the Blue Roses, and the Poxmakers of Nurgle. All of this is kind of fine, you know, these are, let's say, the evil ones in a radius around your starting location, that's fine. But then it's Clan Pestilence, located in Lustria. So either they are destroyed by someone else, or you have to get there, which luckily is easier given that there's some sea lanes that go from here, you know, from Lustria to the area in Cathay. But it's still a lengthy campaign indeed. Now the best part is that it is unique for Lizardmen. You know, it's no longer Dominate Lustria, you know. So Nakai is, of course, the Wanderer, and his benefits are like that his Nakai Horde unlocks units, while then other hordes use global recruitment to get access to it. Sorry. Nakai's vassals occupy the settlements conquered. Most settlements controlled come with increasing rewards, more on that on the mechanics, and they also incentive to go into Kroxigor Ancient Lords because of the buff for their recruit rank. Best thing is the climate. It's excellent for Nakai, one of the best factions to try and actually paint the map, although it's a horde, but still, it is refreshing considering how much climate typically affects Lizardmen. It's a great faction to just play out because you don't have that issue at all. Your starting location is very defensible. Most likely you're going to take over the Tower of Ashung or Daicheng. And remember that you are a horde faction. So basically, it's not like you're going to focus too much on, you know, the buildings, but of course more on that later because it works in a different way for the mechanics. Now, you simply have to follow in a straight line, really. You cannot go south, you know, there's nothing here as yet. Hopefully there's someday, but there's nothing here as yet, and basically you're going to go into the northern area, finish off the enemies for the short campaign victory, and that's up to it. Now typical enemies will then be anything evil or chaos, but you may run into trouble with some of the Cathay factions. Proceed with caution. As always, ensure that you're prepared for a fight in case they want to have a fight. Well, then by all means you're going to have to. So, diplomatically, you're part of the Order Tide, but for the most part you're so far away from everyone that Cathay will likely be your only best bet for an ally, at least until you get, you know, maybe Empire, maybe others, but it will take quite a while, so that's why I don't include any other options. Of course, if you get them, perfect. Now, enemies will also include Cathay for certain, but try to ensure that that only applies to minor factions. For the most part, you'll have Vampire, Coast, and Counts, Dark Elves, Skaven, Chaos, all will soon become your enemies, and you'll have plenty of fights to go against. Now, so outposts from Cathay should definitely go into their artillery and single entities, perhaps the flyers as well. So in terms of mechanics, whenever you capture a settlement, you can either raise it or you can gift to one of the three, let's say, the three temples. That's what I called. Yes, the three temples. So in essence, that would give different buffs to your armies. I'll show you a little bit more here, but I'll just select this to gift for Quetzal, for instance, and that is up to it. Now you can see that it was gifted for Quetzal, and it has increased there. So the temples of the old ones, it's just basically a series of buffs that you can obtain by gifting regions as a fight to either Quetzal, Itzel, or Shalanka. Now, these range from certain stat boosts to even spawning blessed units that you can recruit using the Old One's favor. It's a sort of currency that you can get. More on that in just a minute. So, those blessed units, or sometimes even army abilities. So, for instance, when you get to this point, you do have the protection of Quetzal, which is really cool. So, you have different army abilities. So, you have 3, and as you can see, it's basically the same, you know, more strength for those specific units, for beasts, Gold One Cavalry, and Nakai even, or you can have, you know, something more into the Winds of Magic. So it's really up to you which ones you prefer to have, but for the most part, of course, what matters is the current campaign effects and then all these buttons that you can unlock. Of course, this also increases the hero capacity, which is also nice, and for this it's always blessed units, so the more advanced units that you can get. We already mentioned this in previous videos, but there's blessed spawnings. They're giving after specific missions. There's a better version of the units that you know of, but in the specific case of Nakai, of course, he can recruit them as well from the temples of the Old Ones, spending that Old One's favor. Now, that Old One's favor is increased by establishing temples, so, you know, raising settlements or gifting settlements to to that vassal faction of yours, and also, those same settlements, they'll always have, as you can see there, Old One's favor generated 6 per turn. So it will be exponential. The more you have, the more favor it will be generated. So at one point, you'll be able to spend that really well. Okay. Now, in terms of that. Oh, in terms of rights, they are changed, heavily modified for Nakai. So what you have is a right of mastery, costs gold, should be noted. Okay, and it's mainly buffs for Croxigors and Sacred Croxigor units. In terms of, these are really significant, ensuring that Nakai actually gets a lot of worth from the Crocs. Then you have the right of allegiance. It does cost favor. Okay, all regions belonging to the defenders of the Great Plan will cause attrition to their enemies. This is great. By the way, your armies are of course immune to this. I think you get a tech that makes them immune, actually. And the right of rebirth, it's giving you a non-replenishing army. Note, it doesn't replenish, but of blessed units that will spawn on the defenders of Great Plan. Otherwise, they don't have armies, so you have to give them these armies so that. But at that point, you know, the vassal will become much more stronger. You know, up until here, they're just providing you some upkeep and, you know, just making sure that you can capture those places and gifting them to the vassals. But at this point, it's much easier. And then we have the Slan Mage Priest, typical one, right of awakening. You should do this at all times so that you can always have, you know, a lot of Slan Mages that you can choose from. And once you do so, you can choose for a specific lore of magic, which you typically don't have access to, which is great, you know, to ensure that you get a little bit more from specific lords, or more options in terms of specific lords. There is no geomantic web, you know, typically, but to note, of course, that one of the main mechanics is how I'll speak up in a moment in terms of the buildings, but it's how you're a horde faction, and very very much a horde indeed, because this Nakai the Wanderer is basically your only main horde, and the other ones are not the same. But more on that on the buildings. I believe it's better to speak to that, you know, in an organized fashion. So Lord Croak, a spellcaster of amazing proportions. He does have, in essence, the Supreme Shield of the Old Ones, very effective damage resistance aura. And then you have the Deliverance of Itzel, 1, 2, and 3. These explosions do not affect friendly troops, and they're huge explosions. He can get a lot of damage done just by himself. A one-man army for himself, for sure. So in terms of province edicts, of course, you don't have any. All that you have is actually army stances. And these are the fairly typical for the Lizardmen. Astromancy, which has, you know, for Vanguard for some units, and campaign line of sight, chance to intercept, as well as, you know, ambush defense chance, which is always great. It's more to use defensively, really, and it does have a 25% movement range cost. Then you have channeling for 15 winds of magic power reserve per turn, and at the cost of 10% movement. You also have encamp, which is basically immune to most attrition, gadget replenishment rate, and ambush defense chance, and note that you don't need movement for this. So you can just wander around in in-camp stance, which is great. It's really great. Then we have ambush for, of course, spawning those ambushes. That is really great for Nakai as well, to remain hidden, because he's your main dude. If he goes away, goodbye. And then we have the march stance as well. You know, so notice the lack of a raiding stance, which for someone like that, there is a horde faction, it's kind of lacking, but still, it's still a decent way of doing things. You know, a decent way of having some stances. Really, for the most part, you should always be in camp, at least if not for the extra replenishment. So buildings, they change severely. So this is into Nakai's horde or other hordes. So Nakai has most of the buildings, so he can go up to level 5, building really tier 5, and he has 7 buildings for full military, and you really need all of them in your horde. This is because you cannot build these anywhere else. Note that Croxicors are currently missing, but that's a bug and it is set to be resolved soon. So in terms of infrastructure, you do have an upkeep and casualty replenishment rate. Note that this goes to tier 5. You have a army capacity and hero capacity for all heroes, and also reduced corruption. You have a upkeep and horde growth, recruitment cost, and horde growth, and also casualty replenishment rate and horde growth. Note that these three, they're shared between this horde and the other horde. So basically the other hordes have access to these three, but not to these two, of course. So specifically for that, in terms of the other ones, because I already have another one, what you can actually build is really this. You can build the portals, so basically that they will reduce the global recruitment duration for specific units, so that you can recruit those units much faster into that army. Of course, nothing stopping you from recruiting that in Nakai's horde and just gifting. That's useful primarily in the early game, of course, but at one point Nakai will be far away, and of course you need to benefit from that global duration, of course. Now you also have the one building for each of the specific heroes that increases the hero capacity as well. Note that it also has for the Skink Oracle, and this is for tier 3, which is great. It's really fast that you can get Skink Oracles with Nakai. And then you have those 3 buildings that I mentioned in terms of replenishment. Note that contrary to Nakai, you can actually build all these buildings in each of your hordes, and of course by all means you should. It will take a while and it costs some money, but by all means you should have that. Now let's speak of research, because it also changes for Nakai. Now you have 2 main lines. One that keeps increasing the army capacity and also the global recruitment capacity, which is great. Okay, so plenty of armies here already, and then you have still the other 3. For the most part, everyone is saying that they never complain about the lack of possibilities for having more armies, because, you know, for the most part you do get that possibility. You know, get plenty of them, so enough for them to conquer the whole map if you wish, of course. And just the non-necessity of protecting the settlements, because they are already protected by so many by the garrisons from the old ones, so it's really cool. So then you have, of course, the second line, which is the tribute from vassals that increases in horde growth as well, which is always nice, and some casualty replenishment rates here. So basically these 2 sequences are good. And then you have, of course, the basic upgrades, let's say for specific units or for a campaign, for instance, you know, having less cost, etc. Special note, for instance, for this, for the causing terror to Croxicors and Sacred Croxicor units, which of course you're going to focus during the campaign. So you should study this a little bit, just to ensure that you have a plan in the beginning, and that you try to reach a specific one that you may wish for. So as always, you have your Lord or Legendary specific skills, the yellow line, red line, or army. So basically, in terms of there's no casting for Nakai, which is great, because that means that with 50 skill points you can pretty much give him everything that you need. A note here on the blue line is that it does include the typical reduced upkeep here and replenishment rate. It also has an interesting enemy hero action success and ambush defense chance reduced, which is always nice. And note that in the first part it does have horde growth, and this is great because Nakai will have more than enough skill points to accommodate it, and of course a little bit more horde growth increased makes, you know, your whole initial parts of the campaign, you know, the early game, much easier. And it's not like he needs anything else at that point, you know, in the beginning. But by all means, you can go into other stuff as well. You don't need to go for this. This is just a preference, you know. Then we have Red Line, which has very good choices. For the most part, of course, you want to pick those for the Croxigors, of course, and then for Temple Guards. So for his typical army, he'll get a couple of those. But remember that you're going to have, for the most part, lots of armies with Croxigors, so it is rather cheap in terms of red line, which ensures that you can get some blue line skills and some yellow line skills much better than in other Lizardmen armies, of course. Now, dinosaurs are all nearly based on one skill set, which is excellent as well. Then some special notes for heroes that, you know, for the most part, you're going to use them for casters, of course. But you do have some, let me show you in the buildings. They do have in specific replenishment. So the Skink Oracle gives mobility, of course, but then you do have the Skink Chief giving replenishment. That's what I wanted to note. And of course, it's really a nice addition, but it's not like you need it for Nakai, so remember that part, because he doesn't have any weird climates overall. He has good climates overall. Magic is also very important, so ensure that you can get a couple of casters, for instance, or that you get a slant mage priest. Of course, you'll have those slants available. So yeah, every lord has specific buffs for specific units, so I'll give you a couple of suggestions later on, but your incentives on using Croxigor Ancients due to how the faction works towards those units as well. So here are the red line skills for the Lizardmen. They have quite a lot of mixed units, so you can have different compositions and buff every unit in that composition very easily. A note on how Croxigors, for instance, take the same skill line of the Temple Guards. So of course some combinations with them are very, very interesting. And then of course over here they have on the skill line on the Spawn King, so together with the Skinks and other missile units such as the Salamanders and Razordon hunting back, so there's going to be some combinations that will use that. So for instance with Nakai, of course nothing not interesting about it. It's mostly Croxigors, so of course you should go into heavily. He buffs them really great. He gives them frenzy, which is always excellent. He gives speed to the whole army, which is always cool, especially for skirmishers, for flyers. That's always interesting, and of course for the single entities. So that's mainly the three ideas that I'll bring you here. You know, tons of Croxigors for that front line, and some missile units, or maybe some flyers if you prefer. The Kodal, of course, being able to buffer for the Croxigors. Maybe, you know, imagine not being able to see these massive beasts. You know, it should be a nice idea for an army, and still plenty of power here and damage dealing potential here. And then of course you can have, you know, the single entity idea, you know, plenty of engines of the gods. You can replace these with anything else really, like an ancient Steganon, for instance, if you prefer, but these are just kind of like the ideas that I would go for. And of course with Croxigor Ancients you can still choose between them having physical resistance or some more weapon strength and melee attack. Always remember that these are not just the buffs that you're going to be getting with these guys, because of course you do have all the other buffs for Croxigors with the rights, for instance, and the tech, of course, like them getting terror. So combinations of these units are most likely. I'll just put some Temple Guards to ensure that you have better choices versus large entities, of course, but you know, having some replenishment, basically some not replenishment, some regeneration abilities there with the Bastillodons here are really good. And of course you can still go with some more missile power and some skirmishing ideas while the enemy comes close to you, and then suddenly you you bring them towards your Temple Guard and Kroxigors, who are the main staying killers. Nothing wrong with going, of course, with some Saurus, some Temple Guards and Kroxigors again, and still more missile units, or into the single entities, as you can see here, or just using some Saurus and different units for all intents and purposes. Very good in terms of red line skills, very safe, of course. You can still go into combinations with the Skinks and the Kroxigors, of course. At this point, I would actually change this. I've kept the same idea here, but I would actually change this and add a few more Kroxigors, just because they're so good under Nakai. And this is mainly because you also have the choice between either Skink Leader or the Beast Tamer. So of course you can either go into the cold ones or the Skink armies. These are very good sweeper armies, you know. And then of course the most basic armies that I've mentioned, you know, if you want to go into the Saurus, into some missile troops, and then some single entities, or just heavily into a good brute force army here, or even, you know, the typical army with the Skinks and the Kroxigors, but still adding in some single entities, why not? Just feel free. They're a very interesting army to go for, into focus different styles, you know, using some slams, using some different lords, always keep changing the sort of army that you go for. And yeah, they're very effective in terms of red line skill line, so that's a great thing for the Lizardmen overall, and of course it affects Nakai as well. So, Nakai offers a unique campaign with the Lizardmen, and with Warhammer 3 overall. Conquering settlements and gifting them actually to your vassal is already quite unique, but having a horde that is your main one, while the others have to draw their power from it, it's quite interesting actually. It's like having a nice short RPG game. In the late game your decisions will feel very important indeed. So the new mechanics and research will feel very fresh, and you still have access to all of the Lizardmen units to ensure quite a lot of variety. Now still, this is definitely a campaign for those that like the Kroxigors, of course, and want to use them extensively. Now your army consists still of good infantry, good skirmishers, good cavalry and flyers, good monsters infantry. Actually, this is great for Nakai, especially after the upgrades as well. Great and vast array of single entities. They do lack typical artillery, and you lack range overall. Now, replenishment is great, mostly due to the climate, really. That's one of the things that Nakai has in advantage against other Lizardmen. It's so much more refreshing. And you also have many solutions to get even more replenishment, which is always very important as a Horde faction. So, time to wander around the world of Warhammer as Nakai the Wanderer.